on schedule. But here's an outstanding individual. I don't have my notes regarding his background, but here's what I can recall. He's a former B-52 pilot. He is a shuttle astronaut with 4 missions under his belt. He's got a PhD from University of Arizona in planetary science. And just to give you a little aside, a week ago, in one of my conversations with him in the morning, that evening I'm channel surfing, and I'm on Fox News. I don't normally go there that often, but I was there at that point. And they were doing a story on manned missions to Mars. I saw a lot of interesting configurations. And then the reporter turned toward an expert. And that expert happened to be the guy I'd been talking to. His name is Tom Jones. And the reason why he's here tonight is that he's working on an article on Flak Bait. The Smithsonian B-26 over the next several years will be completely assembled and will be a highlight of the museum. And they'd asked him to contribute an article to the Aviation Smithsonian magazine. So he came, he asked to come to talk with the vets and to kind of gather in a little bit of B-26 atmosphere. So Tom, if you'd like, please come up.
Hello everybody, can you hear me now? Thank you. My name is Tom Jones. I'm from Baltimore, Maryland originally, and I live in Vienna, Virginia, right to the western side of Washington, D.C. right now. So first of all, I'd like to thank Steve for inviting me to come to your reunion this weekend. Also, I'd like to thank Dave Posky for inviting me to MAPS, and to Kim for providing the facilities for this evening. Those have turned out great, and I'm so happy to be with all of you. It's an honor to be with all the World War II vets here this weekend. I grew up in Baltimore, about 2 miles from the Martin factory that turned out the B-26 Marauder on the East Coast. So I grew up for the first 18 years of my life living with the heritage of the Glenn L. Martin Company, and many of my schoolmates' parents worked at the factory during the war or shortly afterwards, and I certainly knew about the B-26 Marauder, but I had only seen the nose section of Flak Bait in the National Air and Space Museum down in Washington, starting in around 1976 when the museum opened. So it's very nice to be able to write an article for Air and Space Smithsonian magazine about the restoration of Flak Bait, the reassembly that's going on that started this summer. So I thought I would give you a little bit of background about my flying career, but then turn quickly to the Flak Bait visit that I paid to the museum about 2 weeks ago to show you the progress and some of the plans that they have for Flak Bait's restoration. So let's see if I can get this to advance. If not, I can just do it from right here. There we go. So I started out, as I said, growing up in Baltimore. When I was 5 years old, 2 miles from the factory there, my grandmother gave me this book, Space Flight, The Coming Exploration of the Universe. So I was 5 years old, she gave me this little golden book of knowledge. And it's a treasured memento because it was my first book about space flight. And I still have the book. You can see I took it into space with me aboard the space shuttle Columbia. So inside there were no photographs of space because nobody had gone there yet to take a picture. That's how old I am. Inside there were just illustrations of what space might look like. You know, futuristic space stations and some really high-tech spacewalking gear there. But that's really what sparked my imagination. At 5 years old, I began to read everything I could about space flight. And my grandmother, Mary Jones, living in Essex, Maryland, she was a very smart shopper. The cover price is 50 cents for this book. But she waited till it was reduced to 25 cents. And her attitude was, I really love my grandson. I'm going to drop a whole quarter on his future education. That's what got me reading about space flight. And by the time I was 10 years old, at the Martin factory in Middle River, they weren't making Marauders anymore. They were making the Gemini Titan boosters to take astronauts into orbit, 2 at a time on the Titan II Air Force ICBM converted to NASA space launch. So I saw those rockets being built as a 10-year-old. The same factory just across the road from where the Marauders were turned out. And that's really what turned me on to spaceflight. By the time I was in high school, we were landing people on the moon, and I certainly wanted to follow in the footsteps of John Young here. I went to the Air Force Academy to become a test pilot. I flew the B-52, co-pilot aircraft commander. But then, while I was flying in Texas in the B-52 in Strategic Air Command, NASA brought out a new spaceship, which was the Space Shuttle, and it had larger crews, not just 2 test pilots or 3 test pilots. There were scientists and engineers on board, and so my great love in high school, college was science. That's what I majored in. So I decided if I could qualify as a scientist, I might get a slot on the Space Shuttle. So I went back to graduate school, Tucson, Arizona, very familiar with the Peam Air and Space Museum, and to get into the Shuttle Astronaut Corps, I qualified as a PhD space scientist, planetary scientist. So that's what I spent my career doing professionally, and then after being turned down a couple of times by NASA, I finally got hired as an astronaut in 1990. So I had a very rewarding career in the Space Shuttle. I had 4 trips into orbit. That's my first one. That's my second one. That's my third one. I'm going to go rapidly through this because I want to get to Flak Bait. I did have a 4th trip to space on not Endeavour, not Columbia, my first 3 shuttles, but I flew on Atlantis to put the laboratory Destiny into orbit at the International Space Station. That was probably my most rewarding mission back in 2001. You see me on the left here with the rest of my space shuttle crew for my Atlantis flight. My spacewalking partner was Bob Kirby here. Mark Polanski was an Air Force test pilot. He was the co-pilot on the ship. He was our rookie pilot on this mission. Marcia Ivins here was our flight engineer, and she was on her 5th mission into space. She was the most experienced flyer on the Space Shuttle Atlantis. And over on the far right is a Navy test pilot, my classmate from astronaut school, and that's Ken Cockrell. So we had flown in space together on Columbia. Now we're going into space on Atlantis together. So here are the 5 of us right at Cape Canaveral right before liftoff a couple of days earlier. And you won't tell by looking at the picture, but 3 of the 5 of us were born in Baltimore, where this B-26 was born as well. So I'm a native Marylander and Baltimorean. Bob Kirby here was born in Baltimore, and so was Marcia. So think of the tremendous risks, folks, that NASA took sending 3 Baltimoreans into space at one time. And the other 2 guys were sent along to make sure that we didn't make any big mistakes while we were up there. But we had the chance to go to fly to the space station, and here we are blasting off on Atlantis on our mission. Turns out that when you want to fly to the space station, you have to wait till the orbit of that outpost comes over your launch pad. That happens twice a day. The way the celestial mechanics worked out for us, we were leaving Earth at sundown in February of that year. And so here's the takeoff right at dusk, Atlantis roaring into orbit with this big laboratory in our cargo bay. And it turned out not only was it sundown, but it was also the one day in February that the full moon was rising out over the Atlantic Ocean. And so our friends and family saw this as we took off. So there's Atlantis with the 5 of us hanging on by our fingernails headed for space with the full moon rising. And it got even better than that, because as we went higher into the sky, about 20 miles up, we're going about 2,500 miles an hour there, and you can see Atlantis as a little dot, but our smoke trail caught the rays of that setting sun in Florida and sent the shadow all the way to the face of the full moon. So I hold the record for the most beautiful space shuttle launch ever. And there were 135, and if you want to argue with me after the talk, you can do that. But that was the most pretty space shuttle launch ever. When we got to orbit, we actually installed this big laboratory. Bob Kirby, my spacewalking partner, and I were outside on three different spacewalks. We were hooking up all the utility lines that go to the new laboratory on the space station, the Destiny Lab. And Bob, who's a Naval Academy graduate, I still trusted him despite that, but because he's a Naval Academy graduate, he has a lot of cool judgment and skill, and he was able to solve a serious problem we had on our first spacewalk, where the laboratory's cooling system sprang a leak, and it was jetting toxic coolant overboard. Think of your radiator hissing and jetting steam out. Well, this was the laboratory jetting out toxic ammonia coolant. And Bob solved the problem with some very cool thinking under pressure that day. He didn't get on the radio and say, "Houston, we have a problem." He actually did the job and solved the leak in about 5 minutes. I helped him out near the end of that process. And together we were out there for about 19 hours outfitting the exterior of the space station. And that's me on the space station on my 3rd spacewalk. Marcia Ivins took this beautiful picture. Anybody seen the movie Gravity with Sandra Bullock and George Clooney? That was out last year. It's a pretty good movie. I saw it 3 times. Very accurate visually. If they took some liberties with the plot. One thing they didn't tell you in that movie is this little device on the bottom of my backpack. It's an emergency jetpack. So in the movie, Sandra Bullock, the actress, is adrift in space. And she has to solve that problem. She has to get to safety after being cast adrift in space. My backpack on my spacesuit had a little jetpack on the bottom. And so if I broke my tethers and let go and drifted away, even though I promised my mother I wouldn't do that, if I had drifted away, I could have taken out the little joystick from that backpack, turned on the system and squirted some cold gas and flown myself back to the space station. Very slowly and carefully, I would have gotten myself back to the space station. So if Sandra Bullock had had that little jetpack in the movie, she would have flown back into the arms of George Clooney in about 10 minutes, and the movie would have been over. Hollywood just doesn't pay attention to reality, I think. So we helped build the space station by adding on this big laboratory, the big US lab that's the centerpiece of the International Space Station. And this is the way the space station looked when it was completed in 2011. And it's now got 3 laboratories on board, 6 people living up there. And of course, it's the centerpiece of what we're doing in space right now. The shuttles have retired, including the Atlantis, my beautiful ship here. And of course, we're replacing them with the shuttle fleet with commercial taxis. It's taking far too long to do that because the Congress and the President can't figure out a coherent space policy. But that's another story. In the future, NASA is hoping to go out to visit the asteroids, and one of the things I do as a consultant these days is talk with NASA about some of the planning for grabbing a nearby asteroid, bringing it into an orbit around the moon, and sending the astronauts on the new Orion spaceship out there to sample and research the history and composition of that asteroid. That might happen within the next 10 years, again, if the President and Congress can agree on a budget for that activity. And that will lead eventually, 25 years from now, if we do our homework right and we have adequate funding for NASA and its commercial partners, we should be able to get humans on Mars by around 2040. But we have a lot of technical challenges to solve before that. So that's what I do now, is I help NASA on the human spaceflight front. I do a lot of writing, and that's why Air and Space Smithsonian Magazine asked me to do this article about Flak Bait. And I'm the one who proposed the article. I got the idea, and I appreciate the willingness of a lot of you to help out with the article, and I hope I can talk to a lot of you about your experiences on the Marauder. I live about 15 miles from the Udvar Hazy Center at Dulles Airport, where the Flak Bait is now being restored, and I thought I would share a couple of pictures with you about that restoration. Cycle my clicker here. It's not happy. All right, so Flak Bait had an illustrious career, 202 plus combat missions. The nose section was exhibited, as many of you have seen, for more than 35 years at the Air and Space Museum. I guess 76 and 40, almost 40 years. It's been at the World War II gallery at the Air and Space Museum. It's been such a beloved object that you can see the paint has been rubbed off by visitors to the museum before they put plexiglass around it. So it's seen a lot of wear and tear in combat. It's seen a lot of wear and tear from visitors. If you looked in the back of the aircraft's nose section, you would have seen some of the crew equipment that they used to exhibit the aircraft, and that's the way it looked until this summer. And now they plan to restore the aircraft, and they started on this project. And I went out 2 weeks ago and visited the restoration team and got the big picture of what they hope to do. Here's the nose section being moved into the restoration hangar, along with the other sections of the fuselage. And I got there on October 8th, and I saw all 3 of the sections here lined up in the hangar under the plastic tarps. And then the restoration team was kind enough to show me all around the aircraft. And these are some of the restoration specialists on the right. And this is Malcolm Kalm, who's a preservationist. He's the curator of preservation or conservation. So they want to preserve and conserve Flak Bait, not give it a brand new paint job and make it look like it came out of the factory. They want to preserve the fabric, the combat history of the airplane, the texture of the airplane, as well as making it structurally sound when they reassemble it. So here's a close-up of the artwork on the nose of Flak Bait. Again, you could have seen this nose section in the downtown museum. Here's the artist, Simonatus, who painted that nose art, and I think he's still alive. Here are some of the installations for the package guns that were removed here during the shipment over to the restoration hangar, where the 250 calibers were on the side of the nose section. And they got everything from the aircraft. It was It was disassembled by an air depot crew in Oberpfaffenhofen, Germany in 1945, I believe. And then it was crated up and shipped back to Illinois, where it stayed until about 1960, before the Air and Space Museum brought it to its storage facility in Maryland. But everything everything that was crated and shipped back home is still in either the restoration hangar or in their storage facility. They're trying to get all the boxes out of storage so they can inventory and assess the state of the airplane. That's the original plexiglass nose. Out on the floor of the restoration hangar, you see engine cowlings and mounts, cowl flaps, propeller blades. They've built some scaffolding and shelves to hold the leading edges of the wings, again with the flak damage, more than 1,000 flak punctures and damage to the airplane, and they're all just patched up with the original paint. Hasn't been touched in the last 70 years. And you can see some of the fabric patches on the wing leading edges and on the control surfaces here. I think these are ailerons. And the propeller blades were packed away and coated with a preservative, and so they've got to use a solvent to get that off, and they've just started to reveal the decals underneath the original propeller blades. Here are the tires, the nose gear and the two main gear in the background. In fact, you can see that the main gear actually have different tire treads. The two different tires have different tread patterns. Just use whatever spare was available out of the system there. The cowlings for the engines with the big carburetor air scoops, along with all the original wear and tear on those. Here is the Martin power turret that was on the dorsal top side of the airplane, and there's the Martin decal on the armor plate. And so I looked down into the turret and could look right at the gunner's seat. That's the flat bottom of the seat. This is the wall of the armor plate sitting behind his back. Looking aft through that tail section of the plane towards the tail gunner's position, you see the open waist gun positions, some of the ammunition tracks made by the Lionel Train Company to feed the 50 caliber machine gun ammunition to the tail. And there's a lot of sheet metal damage on the bottom, some hanger rash from crating it and uncrating it. That's the tail gunner's position from the inside, looking aft. But it's all superficial, and they're going to fix the things that were damaged in storage and transit, but not repaint the entire aircraft. They're going to just try to keep it the way it looked in 1945 when it came off the flight line. Here's the Bell power turret that used to hold the 50 calibers. They'll be put back in place when they put it on display. Looking forward again into the radio compartment and into the cockpit through the bulkhead, you can see the way it was displayed downtown. And they've taken all the crew equipment out, but you can see the original radio gear. And one of the most interesting parts of the whole thing, the whole visit, was this is the right front nose section looking towards the wing, towards the aft. So it would be around this side of the B-26 here. A lot of flak patches that you see in the zinc chromate color. But these are all pencil graffiti all over the nose of the airplane, signed and written by the disassembly crew in Germany at the air depot when Flak Bait was being disassembled. So if you get your nose up close, you'll see 44th Air Depot, Munich, Germany. Oberpfaffenhofen was the name of the town. And here's that same inscription, Munich, Germany. Here's another guy, Lacey B. Worley, Charlotte, North Carolina, Oberpfaffenhofen, Germany. And a flak patch labeled Illinois, another one that was labeled Michigan, riveted in place over some of the flak damage. Oberpfaffenhofen was the depot location. There's a space shuttle connection there. Actually, the German Space Agency has a research laboratory in Oberpfaffenhofen. And when I flew on my first two shuttle flights, our science targets were all over the world, but we had one in Oberpfaffenhofen, Germany, for our radar imaging system on board. So we were always imaging Munich and Oberpfaffenhofen, Germany, as we came overhead on hundreds of orbits around the Earth. And so we began calling it overflown too often, Germany. So, one more look at the patchwork here, and they're going to keep, I think, a lot of this stuff. One of the decisions they have to make is whether they put the air depot signatures as part of the fabric of the airplane or whether they remove those because they were not part of the combat record of the airplane. And under the floorboards, they're finding interesting relics of World War II. Here is a piece, or several pieces of German flak that were found underneath the floorboards in the airplane as they've taken it out of storage and moved it over to the restoration hangar. They're going to be finding more things like that as they take the airplane apart. And here's a shot on the flight line when it was in service. I think the most interesting part of the whole story is not just the Baltimore-produced Marauder itself, Flak Bait being the most experienced example, but the most interesting part of the story, I think, for the article and for the whole restoration story is the men who flew and supported the airplane in combat. And so it's rare in the National Air and Space Museum collection to find a combat veteran airplane. There just weren't that many of them that came back after the war. They have the Enola Gay. They have a seaplane that was present at the Pearl Harbor attack that's going to be restored and put on display. They're going to have a B-17 that has combat experience, but Flak Bait is uniquely representative of, I think, the long commitment to win World War II. And the curator of the World War II aircraft collection is a guy named Jeremy Kinney, and when I talked to him about this project, he said, this is going to tell the story of how many years it took to win World War II, and how long the country had to be committed to win that battle, and how long the hardware had to be committed to that battle, and how ruggedly built the B-26 in particular was to carry out the campaign over Europe until victory was won. So this is a great story that I'm looking forward to writing about, and I hope to contact some of you by phone in the future. I'll be around tomorrow morning for breakfast, trying to collect your big picture impressions of what the B-26 meant to the war effort and what perhaps you thought of the airplane when you worked on it, when you flew in it, when you flew it in combat. So if you've got some recollections, I'll try to be down in the lobby tomorrow morning. I'll be here, of course, till we leave tonight. If you want to tap me on the shoulder, give me your phone number. I'll be glad to give you a call in the next couple of weeks. I've got to turn in the article in November sometime, and it'll appear in the April-May issue of Smithsonian's Air and Space magazine in connection with the 70th anniversary of World War II. Steve, thank you for the time. Folks, thank you for listening to me.